Our lecture today deals with Dada, Surrealism, and American Modernism. No single event has influenced the development of modern art as profoundly as World War I. That quote comes directly from the textbook, and besides the development of photography, I would say that yes, this statement is very, very true. World War I was a horrific battle, the first time we have a worldwide conflict, a war fought with poison gas and trench warfare, our first war fought with tanks and airplanes. 25 million people are injured in the war horrifically, 10 million people are killed, and it affects artists tremendously. Of course, you have many of the futurist artists, for instance, being killed in the war. But those that didn't fight in the war were still affected. When you think of Picasso, the leading artist of abstraction, all of a sudden he goes to painting very classical images, very much in the style of Michelangelo. But art does continue on. It emerges with Dada after the war. And the term Dada itself is a very unique word. In English, of course, it sounds like baby talk. But in French, it translates to hobby horse. In Russian, Dada means yes, yes, while in Romanian, it means no, no. And the emergence of Dada is quite unique because everything up to now, when we've studied modern art, really emerges from Paris, with the exception of Futurism. But here we have an art movement that emerges simultaneously from 4 different cities: Zurich, New York, Berlin, and Paris. Up until now, we've been arguing the idea of tradition. What is the correct way of painting an object? When we look at Manet's Luncheon on the Grass, this has been, up till now, the most scandalous painting because it pushes the boundaries of what is acceptable art, at least the acceptable way of creating it. The idea of the nude figure being created without the semitones, without the use of the technique of chiaroscuro. Manet's lack of linear perspective. The idea of narrative being lost in this work, and of course, visible brushstrokes. But now Dada comes around and forces us to answer a bigger question. What is art? And it's very unique to see the types of art that emerges from these cities. Up in Zurich, we have people like Hugo reciting his sound poem at the Cabaret Voltaire, where he's dressed up very similar to the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz, and he recites poems that sound like Zim, Zim, Zimbala, Zam. His argument is that the human figure can exist in abstraction, and in poetry, he is abstracting words. Over in Berlin, we have photo montage heralded by the female artist Hannah Hoch. And with her works, she cuts out pictures and newsprint from magazines and newspapers and creates artwork that deals with current events, such as this one here, which deals with women in the workforce. We also have John Heartfield, who argues against the rise of Hitler with his photo montage. Over in New York, we have photography going on, such as the work by Man Ray at the right, and he also created the sculpture at the left, which is a flat iron that has 14 tacks glued to the base of it, making it unusable. But really, the most significant city that we see Dada in is Paris. And it's led there by the artist Marcel Duchamp, who today, if you continue to study art history, and particularly art history theory, we have a tremendous amount of credit that we have to give him for making art dealing with conceptual activities. Now, Marcel is originally Hungarian, but spends most of his life in Paris, and then during the World War II, he moves to the United States, originally to New York, but eventually over to Southern California. And he was trained as a Cubist artist, very much in the same way of Picasso. He was the one who created the famous nude descending a staircase. But we're also going to look at his ready-mades in this work, in this lecture. Nude descending a staircase is a abstracted form that's moving from the upper left down to the lower right. It was a painting that first made headlines in America when it was shown in the famous Armory show of 1913. And it was ridiculed. We didn't understand this painting. It was the first time Americans had seen European modern art and abstraction. And we really didn't know how to take it and what to do with it. And so he became famous or infamous with this work. Now, ready-mades are already constructed objects. And especially, as you can imagine, in the early 1900s, how humorous these might have looked in a museum. Ready-mades are the transformation of commonly manufactured objects into works of art. But what we've done really is bypassed the artist himself. That we don't have to have a God-given talent, any artistic talent, in order to create these works. Craftsmanship has gone out the window. We are creating basically a mechanical process more than anything. So it is a full-on assault of the artistic tradition. And here's a couple more ready-mades. The snow shovel at the left, and then the image of the Mona Lisa at the right is what's called an assisted ready-made, which he took a manufactured postcard and added the goatee and mustache to her, and adding the letters LHOOQ when pronounced rapidly in French. There's a sexual innuendo about that phrase. And so what he's done really is he's taken the most beloved, admired work of Western art and ridiculed it, made fun of it. And that's really very similar in essence to the Futurists, that these people hated the past and they were looking for a new type of art. Now with Dada, this is probably the most famous image of any of the artworks. Fountain is by the artist Marcel Duchamp, but he signs the work, as you can see in the lower left-hand corner, MUTT, which is a takeoff on the name of the manufacturer of the urinal of which this is. What happens is the artist takes this to an art exhibition, pays $6 for its admittance, and it's removed from the show floor. And he writes about this, Duchamp writes about this incident in a magazine called The Blind Man, and he calls it the Richard Mutt case. He says, quote, "They say that any artist paying $6 may exhibit. Mr. Richard Mutt sent in a fountain, and without discussion this article disappeared and never was exhibited. What were the grounds for refusing Mr. Mutt's fountain? First, some contend it was immoral or vulgar. And others say that it was plagiarism. This was a plain piece of plumbing. Now, we can toss aside number 1 pretty easily. The idea that Mr. Mutt's fountain is not immoral, no more than the bathtub is immoral. It's a fixture that we see every day in a plumber's store window. What's important really is part 2, which is the idea of plagiarism, that it's been called a plain piece of plumbing. Marcel Duchamp says whether Mr. Mutt with his own hands made the fountain or not has no importance. The thing is, he chose it. He took an ordinary article of life, placing it so that its useful significance disappeared under the new title and point of view. He created a new thought for that object. So what he's done really is he stated that art has become conceptual, meaning that the idea behind the work is more important than the work itself. And even though this is in the early 1900s, it's going to set the stage for the contemporary era of art, post-1945, post-World War II. And again, we're looking back at Duchamp as one of the leaders for this movement. So we're going to switch over to the next art movement, which is Surrealism. Surrealism is pretty awesome because it spans really the largest amount of time compared to the other art movements. When we look at Fauvism or Futurism, we're looking at about 5 years for those. Surrealism lasts for about 3 decades. We see it in the 1920s all the way through the 1950s. Now, unlike Renaissance artists who thought artistic talent was God-given, Surrealists believed that the talent or inspiration from art came from the subconscious, that it drew on people's impulses, desires, and fears. Tension is present between interior and exterior, conscious and unconscious, dream and reality, the idea that there's juxtaposition in these works. The Surrealists were led by ANDRÉ Breton, who, like Tommasino Marinetti, was a writer. He didn't really produce any art. And he wrote the Surrealist Manifesto, which is like 26 pages long, and no one read it. So he came up with a second Surrealist Manifesto, which was only about 3 pages long. You can think of Surrealism very much like an exclusive club, and this gentleman was the leader. He would allow you in, but you had to live up to his expectations. People like Salvador Dali, even though we associate Dali with Surrealism more than any other artist, really was kicked out of the Surrealists in 1936. But we remember his name, not André Breton. But we also have some people who, like Picasso, didn't even know they were Surrealist or had been accepted into the movement until André Breton surprised him and said, yeah, Picasso's one of us. So I'm going to show you just a survey of some of the most famous of the Surrealist artists. Max Ernst, who was a German army officer during the First World War. Then he went into be a Dadaist. He was an inventor of frottage, which is a way of creating visual texture through rubbing on textured surfaces. He would put a piece of paper up against a textured surface, and we probably all did this as kids, and then used charcoal or graphite to make the image come through onto the paper, or the texture come through. Among his famous works is Two Children Threatened by a Nightingale, which you can see written in French on the lower part of the frame. But it's a unique work because you have more than 2 children here. You have 3. We have the 2 children on the ground, and then one looks like it's being absconded with or maybe taken to safety with a gentleman on top of a chicken coop or a house. We're not sure what that is. reaching for a doorknob that's actually in our space. It's a very cool and unique work. This is a work made by Frottage, and you can see the different textures that are available here, particularly with the outcropping just left of center. And again, it's paper on a textured surface, rubbed with graphite or charcoal to produce this type of visual element. Juan Miró. This is an artist who experimented with Fauvism and Cubism, but is really known for his surrealist works. Very abstract in terms of imagery. Again, we've got a lot going on here. A lot of these images, Miró said, came to him during hallucinations. Salvador Dalí, as I mentioned, kicked out of the Surrealists in 1936, but this is the artist that we recognize today as the foremost surrealist artist. I don't think there's one of us that hasn't seen the persistence of memory, the idea of the melting clocks. And I'll just show you a few of his more famous paintings here. René Magritte, this is an artist from Belgium. And whereas you saw Juan Miró do very abstract works, Magritte does works that are very representational. But he also warns us about this. With the treachery of images, this is a painting of a pipe, but it tells us in French underneath it that this is not a pipe, that it reminds us that this is a painting. It's a way that we choose to represent the world. Just like in this painting, we have a painting of the sky at the left, and then the French word for sky at the right. The menaced assassin plays on juxtaposition. We're not sure the relationship between the man and the woman, if he is a murderer or someone who has come in to find this scene in front of him. We're not sure who the gentlemen are looking at this scene through the back window. We also have the two individuals on either side of the foreground, and we're not sure whether they're good or bad, and it is totally based on the idea of whether the person playing the record player, the Victrola, is good or bad. Picasso, an artist who didn't know he was a surrealist until told by ANDRÉ Breton, but he did make a couple of fun works that are definitely surrealist. Besides Bull's Head, there's also his famous Girl Before a Mirror, which is an image of his mistress, Marie-Therese Walker. Now, with all these wonderful things happening in and throughout Europe, we look over back at American modernism and what are we producing here in this country? And it's basically very plain, very boring, very iconic images like this, American Gothic. They're very plain Americana types of work, and many of us would say that these are extremely boring works. This is by Grant Wood, a Midwest artist. In fact, I believe he was from Iowa. And this is another probably more famous work, but again, very quiet, very slow-paced type of work by Edward Hopper, who works up in the Northwest corridor. He is a New York artist, and he is he travels a lot throughout New England. So we see many of his lighthouses, we see studies of interiors, and his images are very quiet. They're about isolationism, they're about loneliness, This painting has probably the most figures of any other painting that comes to mind. Normally there is one person in a painting or two people. But again, these are people who are not really interacting. The couple that are next to each other doesn't even really know the other one is there. He's looking forward while she's studying a matchbook cover. The gentleman at the far left, who is the Nighthawk, this is a person who is by himself and his back is to us. The person working behind the counter is separated from everyone by the counter itself, and we're separated from all of them because there is no door to the cafe. We can't go and join them. It's also a fun work because it's the first painting ever done in or using painting fluorescent light, and that's very cool and unique. But by the time we get to Nighthawks in the early 1940s, we're just steps away from an explosion of American art, and we have the very first American modern art movement called abstract expressionism, and that's going to be the focus of our next lecture, because we're going to see art go from very representational all the way to the other extreme of non-representational, or what's called non-objective art, with people such as Jackson Pollock. And so that'll be next lecture on abstract expressionism.